questioning of President Bill Clinton. I say that because I was around for both of them and reported on them at the time. Saul, can you go first and tell us what you learned today about the Mueller investigation?
Well, that it's what we always suspected, that it's very serious, that it's here to stay, that it's ruthlessly efficient and doing really substantive work. That Manafort indictment, even though the press secretary is correct, it didn't mention the president at all, it's a very substantial alleged crime. It's the kind of indictment that any U.S. attorney's office in any district in the country would make a very big deal of. There'd be a press conference from the U.S. attorney, and that would be true irrespective of who the defendant was. This is a very serious indictment with very substantial allegations.
Peter, same question to you, and what does it mean that Papadipoulos was nowhere on anybody's radar when we left work on Friday night?
Well, what it says is the special counsel has been working appropriately under the radar, and it's both the ethical way to do his job without leaking, but it's also extremely effective in that not for the other defense counsel, for other witnesses not knowing what's going on makes it much easier for the prosecutor to make his case. Papadopoulos being under the radar means that the investigators were able to go out and question persons 1, 2, and 3, the senior campaign advisors that were identified in the plea agreement, and they were completely unaware that there's already an accounting in the record under oath from this guy, George Papadopoulos.
So, Saul, the feds walk into Dulles Airport at the height of summer in July. Somehow, quietly, they grab an adult male and get out of there. Nobody knows nothing. He goes back to his work and life, we are to presume. Today, he is called a proactive cooperator. Does that mean, as has been speculated all day, that he was wearing a wire?
It's certainly possible that he was wearing a wire. Peter makes a very good point about the other individuals who would have been questioned not knowing that Papadopoulos was cooperating, but also he could have very easily called them and done consensual monitoring. Wouldn't even need a court order for that. Keep in mind, he's arrested in July. The plea is not finally signed and filed under seal until October the 5th. That's plenty of time to do undercover work for them. And by the way, the actual plea itself and the information is very, very simple. It wouldn't have taken long to finalize that. It's a simple one-count information to a false statement. Very simple plea agreement.
Peter, there's something in your line of work called a superseding indictment, where basically it's an add-on, it's a bolt-on with more charges. How are they coming after Manafort? Do they say to him, look, this was just to get you in here, to get you in the criminal justice system. We have this many things we're looking at. How would you like to make our job easier? Because if you get nicked on some of these charges, you're going to die in prison.
Well, it's entirely possible, but I don't personally think it's likely. The indictment that has already been brought doesn't need any extra weight in terms of an inducement to plead guilty and cooperate. It's extremely detailed, and the amount of money involved is what drives the sentence under the sentencing guidelines. So he is looking at many years, if not decades, in prison. And frankly, in looking at that indictment, I don't think it's defensible. I think most defense attorneys would look at that indictment if they had a client come in and say, we're going to have to make a deal. You can't try this case. So is a superseding indictment possible? Yeah, it's possible, but I don't think it's necessary in order to flip Paul Manafort.
Wow, that focuses the mind. And Saul, how are Flynn's lawyers looking at what happened today?
Well, there's nothing directly related to Flynn, but again, it's consistent with the way Mueller has always operated and the way Andrew Weissman has always operated. These are very serious people who are extremely aggressive. So I would say they're going to be very worried if they weren't already worried. I think it is worth mentioning that there is absolutely nothing in the Manafort indictment about Trump or the administration, and that even in the Papadipoulos criminal information, even though the press secretary is wrong, it clearly talks about the Trump campaign and campaign officials. There's nothing whatsoever implicating the president himself.
An important point that we need to note. Thank you both, gentlemen, so much for being on with us and explaining a lot of what happened today. Peter Zeidenberg, Saul Weisenberg, our thanks. Coming up as we continue, the White House has repeatedly said the president has no plans to fire Robert Mueller. Did that change at all? President Trump has repeatedly dismissed the Russia investigation and Robert Mueller's investigation as a witch hunt or a hoax. But as today's New York Times put it, Mueller's first indictments send a message to Trump. Their chief White House correspondent, Peter Baker, writes, quote, the first charges filed by Robert S. Mueller III, the special counsel, did not implicate Mr. Trump, but collectively amounted to a political body blow to a president who has spent months insisting that Mr. Mueller's investigation was nothing more than a witch hunt based on a hoax invented by Democrats and the news media. That author, Peter Baker of the New York Times, is with us now. Peter, to borrow from a bumper sticker phrase, today is the first day of the rest of his presidency. But put a finer point on it. How did President Trump's life change as of today?
Well, you played the clip earlier of John Kelly, his chief of staff, saying how distracting this was for him. Imagine how much more distracting it's going to be now that we have indictments, now that we have, in fact, a possible trial of his former campaign chairman, now that we have the knowledge that witnesses are, in fact, talking to Robert Mueller, and they're telling him things that we didn't know publicly before. You've already said on your show already tonight, George Papadopoulos' indictment and guilty plea, came as a shock to most of Washington and certainly even to the White House, which had thought that they were going to get off today with just these financial charges against Paul Manafort, and they'd be able to say, well, this has nothing to do with the president. What George Papadopoulos admitted today in that statement of offense that he signed is, in fact, he did make an effort on behalf of the campaign to reach out to Russia to get dirt on Hillary Clinton, and he kept top campaign people advised of his progress.
2 or 3 news organizations are reporting tonight that Bannon is now urging his old boss, Donald Trump, to go after Mueller more aggressively. Donald Trump's at, if you want to reduce it to math, between 33 and 38% in available polling. Would be interesting to see after today where Mueller is on approval polling. But what is fraught about Mr. Bannon's calculus?
Well, look, President Trump tends to do better when he has somebody to attack. That's the way he conducts his politics. He feels more comfortable, more confident when he has an enemy. That's why he is so frequent on Twitter, creating new ones, even when he didn't have one at the beginning of a day. Now, whether that would actually work with the public is a different thing. We've seen this script before. Attacking a prosecutor is something politicians tend to do when they're in trouble. You saw not just what Steve Bannon apparently is saying. You saw Roger Stone, another sometime advisor to the president, saying that he should create an investigation that would get Robert Mueller conflicted out. You saw some conservative activists saying that the president should fire Robert Mueller, saying he had exceeded his mandate. You've seen others saying he should pardon Paul Manafort or others to try to short-circuit this investigation. I think any of those tactics would simply inflame an already pretty flammable situation, and it would definitely cause a storm on Capitol Hill, not just among Democrats, but certainly among at least some Republicans.
Peter, use a wider lens and tell me about Washington. What happened to the Trump administration, the Trump agenda as of today? And wider still, he leaves at the end of this week for the most consequential trip of his presidency. And by the way, it may include a visit to the DMZ.
Right, that's exactly right. And today he, my colleagues, the New York Times reported, I think some others reported as well, that he's made a choice for who's going to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve. That may be the most consequential appointment he makes in this first term of his presidency, and yet it becomes overshadowed by controversy and scandal. He wants to have this tax reform bill introduced to committee on Wednesday. That's the biggest legislative initiative he has left in this first year of his presidency. And as you say, he leaves Friday for Asia. These are big things. These are things that any president would want to focus on, and instead the focus of this week will almost certainly be on the question of this Russia collusion and what we've learned now and what these various indictments and legal issues hanging over him will really mean. And he won't let it go. The thing is, other presidents might try to find a way to move the topic back to taxes, back to the Federal Reserve or other things. President Trump is unlikely to sort of not mention this for the rest of the week. That's not his style.
Peter Baker, fresh from creating so much of what we read during the week, we thank you so much for coming on the broadcast after such a busy day for all of us. Thank you, Peter. Another break for us. Coming up, Trump warned a President Hillary Clinton would face investigations, remember, and a protracted constitutional crisis. That was during the campaign. We'll contrast it.
This is the biggest political scandal since Watergate. If Hillary Clinton were to be elected, it would create an unprecedented and protracted constitutional crisis. Hillary is likely to be under investigation for many years, probably concluding in a criminal trial. Hillary has engaged in a criminal massive enterprise and cover-ups like probably nobody ever before.
A year ago this week, then candidate Trump was delivering his final pitch to voters about why a Clinton presidency was bound to run into legal troubles and then some. And while Republicans in Congress look to move forward with their agenda, questions remain about whether or not the White House can give lawmakers any kind of assist. David Leonhardt writes in a New York Times opinion piece, quote, "I encourage you to keep in mind just how weak a President Donald Trump already is. He's probably weaker than any first-term president in more than a century, based on his standing with the American public, his own party members in Congress, and even his own cabinet officials." Just today, news broke that the Gallup tracking poll, taken over a 3-day period prior to today's news, had President Trump earning a new low in his approval rating, 33%. Even before those numbers, Pew Research found that global confidence in the U.S. president plummeted at the beginning of Donald Trump's term. With us now, Cornell Belcher, a Democratic pollster, worked on both of President Obama's campaigns and with a number of House and Senate Democrats, and David Jolly, former Republican member of Congress from the great state of Florida. Congressman, I'm going to begin with you because we looked something up. We looked up a quote from you the day Mueller was appointed. You were on the air with us, and you said,
That's right.
Donald Trump's done. He's done. There's no question about that. He's done. I do want to show you the front page of tomorrow's Washington Post. And this is bracing. You don't see this kind of tall typeface. You don't see that much of a newspaper front page, especially that newspaper given to one story. It is day 284, and that is the headline of this administration. I'm guessing, Congressman, you didn't see anything today to dissuade you from your conclusion.
No, look, this is a president that will continue to survive week by week, if you will, but his presidency in the long lens of history is crippled, and we know that. Bob Mueller is 6 steps ahead of this president. We saw that today with the Papadipoulos confession or agreement, indictment. And listen, this president is going to be subjected to the tightening of the noose, if you will, in this investigation. And so while some Republicans might think that he won today because there was no smoking gun, this is really just the very beginning, and his agenda is crippled. It is crippled on Capitol Hill. The leverage that Bob Mueller has right now is remarkable in terms of the presidency itself, but that leverage will be excruciating for Republicans on Capitol Hill to deal with in the weeks and months to come. This is a president whose agenda is over.
Well, that gets our attention, as it did the first time back when Mueller was appointed. Cornell, some will argue that the real issue the whole time that we're not focusing on is Hillary Clinton. Witness the next piece of video. Corey Lewandowski, Fox News, Saturday morning. We'll talk about it afterwards.
The speculation is so insane right now. What we should be focusing on are the continued lies of the Clinton administration, the continued fallacies that they perpetuate.
So now, Cornell, it's an administration. You may not have noticed it, but there was a Clinton administration involving Hillary Clinton who was not elected. I kid, but what do you do now? What did Democrats do now?
Well, I think it's kind of startling at how over the bait and switch routine that they're playing is now. And it's kind of frightening, right? I mean, they're clearly trying to sort of try this bait and switch, and it's all about Hillary. But to the congressman's point, and to the front page of the Washington Post, this is really serious, right? I would argue that most of his agenda was already in trouble from repealing Obamacare, which you didn't have a majority in favor of repealing Obamacare, and you certainly don't have a majority of Americans in favor of the current tax plan. So you have a very unpopular president, trying to push forth things that are, quite frankly, broadly unpopular. So I think there was problems from that. Democrats have to be careful, though, not to overplay their hand too much, right? At this time, frankly, Democrats probably need to step back and let some of this unfold and not get too aggressive and overplay their hand and look too political in all this, because I think that could possibly hurt them. The thing that's playing for Democrats right now is when you look at the latest polling out there right now, Democrats are now preferred to take over Congress by 7 points. I think that will continue to grow. And in some of the battleground states, the Democrats' numbers are holding up and improving. I think Democrats have to be really careful not to look too overly political and overplay their hand in this thing. So I think, caution, but it's looking like a midterm with an unpopular president, a House and Senate that hasn't accomplished very much. It is looking like, perhaps 2006 again for Democrats, although I think Democrats still have some work to do around talking about what they plan to do for the country.
Hey, Congressman, when do congressional Republicans start sounding more like you, more serious and perhaps more concerned?
There will be a fatigue that sets in as Mueller continues to move on with this investigation. But the big question is whether or not this administration moves to cut Mueller's authority. And we saw the administration today say the president does not intend to do that. But if the president of the United States, or frankly if Republicans in Congress begin to rally around this idea that they are going to cut off Mueller's authority, or even the president might fire him, not only would that be likely the end of this presidency, it could be the end of the modern GOP. There's a reason that Jimmy Carter swept in after Watergate, and it had much to do with President Nixon's handling of the investigation. Listen, there are very fair questions about Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. We saw the investigation move potentially to Podesta today, but it is not a binary choice, one or the other. And the reality is no distraction by the Republicans about Fusion GPS and Hillary distracts from the fact that Mueller's playing chess while the president's playing on Twitter, and eventually Mueller's going to get this president.
Cornell, do you have any doubt that the parties would come together, forget everything else, in an effort to save the job of Robert Mueller because of the crisis that would pose?
I would hope that they would. I will say one cautionary thing is that the ban and stuff, I take that seriously. I think, there is a real sort of rousing in the base of the Republican grassroots, anti-establishment, anti-Mitch McConnell, anti-Speaker, Speaker Ryan, that's going to challenge some of these cats and some of these members in the primaries, and some of them could possibly lose. So I hope they do the right thing, but I think the political calculation is a little different.
A serious conversation tonight, because today it seemed to take a serious turn. Gentlemen, thank you. Cornell Belcher, David Jolly. Appreciate you both very much being on tonight. Coming up after our next break, the White House was asked about the president's promise that his administration would have the best people. Steve Schmidt weighs in on that when we come back.
he promised to hire only the best people. Is this an example of the best people to hire?
Look, again, this goes back to these were activities that took place outside of the scope of the campaign. I can't comment on anything they did.
But are these the best people to hire?
Look, the president hired Paul Manafort to handle the delegate process, which he did, and he was dismissed not too long after that.
And Sarah, to just follow up on the point of hiring the best people, the top people, he said, does this not at the very least raise questions about President Trump's vetting process and judgment when it comes to bringing on these people?
I don't believe so.
Paul Manafort was chairman of the campaign, by the way. After campaigning on the promise of, as you heard, hiring the best people, the Trump administration is now publicly, as you saw, downplaying the connections and importance of people like Manafort, Gates, and Papadipoulos. Washington Post opinion author Michael Gerson, famously the former speechwriter for Bush 43, wrote today, quote, "To what circle of hell are Republican officials about to consign themselves? It would be useful for members of Congress to declare that they will never enter the fourth circle, the demolition of the integrity and independence of the FBI, if only to deter Trump from forcing a constitutional crisis." To speak to that very point, I am joined tonight by our friend Steve Schmidt, a veteran of the Bush White House and the McCain campaign, also an MSNBC political analyst. Steve, what changed today in your mind?
Well, the investigation has borne fruit. We have a conviction with a guilty plea, and we have 2 indictments. And the 2 indictments and the guilty plea move this story much closer to the White House than it was yesterday. And not for nothing, Brian, I think it's important to remember that Paul Manafort, indicted for conspiracy against the United States, is one of the parties in the room meeting with officials of the Russian government for the purposes of receiving dirt on the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. And, of course, also in that room are the president's son and the president's son-in-law. And we know that the president was directly involved in an effort to mislead the American people materially about that meeting. Donald Trump Jr. lied about it on the Sean Hannity television show. His lies unraveled very quickly. And so what we see today is the accumulation of all the lies over the first months of this administration about the campaign's dealings with Russia. And we see the first tangible evidence, the first links today.
Steve, what would have happened if you were, back when you were with the McCain campaign, if I'd come to you and said, I've got buddies overseas and they have some dirt on Barack Obama, and I really don't like this Obama character, and I'm looking to defeat him, would you be interested?
Yeah, I would have called the director of the FBI.
That simple?
That simple. Any loyal American does that. This meddling, which is acknowledged by our intelligence services, this attack on our election systems, it seems so difficult for so many Republicans to understand this. But this was not an attack on the Democratic Party. This was an attack on the United States of America. If a foreign adversary reaches out, trying to interfere in our election process by trying to deleverage, to hurt the nominee of one of the 2 parties. In this case, I'm a Republican, so it would be the Democratic nominee. You call the FBI. Full stop.
Steve, this calls for total speculation, but I'm curious how you'll answer. How does this end? Does this end with a 2-term, 79-year-old president relaxing, enjoying the rest of his life at one of his golf resorts? But does it end earlier than that, and how?
Look, I think that if you were just to bet, one, I think there's a much greater likelihood for a lot of different reasons that he finishes sooner than he signed up for. That being said, the chances are still much greater that he'll serve out his full term. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know, for example, what will be of General Flynn. Is he already cooperating with the investigation for the purposes of speculating openly? We do know this. The president goes to China as weak as he possibly can be. His legislative agenda completely stalled. No members of his party out there defending him today. The White House engaged in a misinformation campaign supported by media allies, the likes of which we've never seen in the United States of America, sheer propaganda. The Chinese leader, after the Chinese Communist Party conference, is now the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. The threat of the situation in North Korea continues to escalate, and Donald Trump is the least popular president this early into his term in the history of polling in the United States. So there are many, many issues to be concerned about. What we do know about this investigation is Robert Mueller is holding it close. We're going to find out what's happening on his terms and nobody else's.
Steve Schmidt, who has a way of summing up what is right in front of us. Steve, thank you so much for joining us and for your voice on our broadcast tonight. The last thing before we go this evening, not the most important development from today, but certainly a curiosity. Today's 12-count indictment of Paul Manafort alleges that he laundered tens of millions of dollars through foreign entities to enjoy what they called a lavish lifestyle here in the United States. And because a federal indictment can have the effect of a living autopsy of your life, we know what he's alleged to have spent on certain things, like over $900,000 at an antique rug store, like the $600,000 plus spent with a New York antique dealer, and the staggering $1.3 million on clothing. All of it spent at a men's store in New York and another one in Beverly Hills. Again, $1,369,000 and change on menswear. There are other things, not one but 3 Range Rovers and a lot of real estate, including a house in suburban Virginia outside Washington, which could be where Manafort will be spending his time under house arrest for the charges he was indicted on today. That is our broadcast on this eventful Monday as we start a new week. Thank you so much for being here with us, and good night from NBC News headquarters in New York.